You are listening to the Caffeinated Thoughts podcast. Hi, this is Shane Vander. Thank you so much for listening. We have a lot to talk about today. First, U.S. Senator Cory Booker, a Democrat out of New Jersey, said those who support Judge Brett Kavanaugh's nomination to the Supreme Court are, quote, complicit in evil, unquote. Then we discuss Iran and North Korea with retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. Hey, Colonel Davis, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us on the Caffeinated Thoughts podcast.
Certainly my pleasure. Always like to be here.
Oh, great. We love having you on. Now, what were your initial thoughts when you read President Trump's tweet on Sunday?
Well, I got to think that, there's times when tough words are useful, and then there's times when tough rhetoric is kind of counterproductive. And I think this kind of falls into that latter category because it could potentially set us up for a troubling possibility and put him in a tough bind because he was responding to what President Rouhani had said earlier, which itself was a response to what Secretary Pompeo had said Sunday in a speech. And what Trump said was, you do not threaten the United States because we're not going to allow you to continue doing that. Well,
right.
Of course, you don't go to war because someone threatens you or with words. And so if he continues to do that, Rouhani, then you get into a situation, well, wait a minute, you just said that you're not going to allow him to threaten you with words like that. So now what are you going to do? And then you have to face, either doing something that would not be good, i.e. making good on a threat to take some kind of military action based on that, or you do nothing. And then that kind of makes you look a little bit, like your word doesn't mean anything. Yeah. Right. So you really have to be careful with that.
Okay. So, well, going back to Iran, I mean, they've been threatening us for years. This is just something that we should actually, I think, expect from Iran, isn't it?
Well, it is. And as a matter of fact, it's interesting you bring that up. I was actually speaking with a good friend of mine who's an Iranian expat who was actually kicked out after the '79 revolution and absolutely hates the regime as much as anybody that I know. But he was also cringing when that happened because he said, the last thing you want to do is give him a platform, meaning Rouhani, a platform to continue to spread his vitriol. He said, because the fact is they say this stuff all the time and have for almost all the time since '79. He said, normally people just ignore it and it just kind of, goes into empty air. But when something like this happens, then everybody plays and it actually gives him a platform he otherwise wouldn't have. And so he's actually saying, there's other things you can do, but that's not helpful to our cause.
Well, definitely elevated him because I saw Iran's foreign minister then tweeted back, "Color us unimpressed." The world heard even harsher bluster a few months ago. I'm not sure exactly what he's referring to there, and Iranians have heard them, albeit more civilized ones, for 40 years. We've been around for millennia and seen fall of empires, including our own, which lasted more than the life of some countries. Be cautious. So it's like, this is just kind of, I want to say remarkable, but that's probably not the best choice of word to use, but it's remarkable that we're seeing these world leaders like tweeting at each other like this.
Right. And that doesn't help us out any, frankly, because it gives them a platform. And when you're looking at, the medium of words, whether it's Twitter or dueling press releases or whatever, it actually gives the impression of equality. So both sides are equal when nothing could be further from the truth. One of the other comments that Rouhani made there was, be careful when you mess with the tail of a tiger. Mm-hmm. And the fact is, it's more like we're messing with the tail of a mouse. Because when you look at the disparity between the economic and the military power of the United States and Iran, I mean, it's almost so small you can't even count it. I think that their total defense spending in 2017 was $14 billion, which, is what we spend on one ship in some cases. So it can't even be compared. And so they are not on our level. They cannot. There's almost nothing they can do militarily to threaten us, and certainly not economically, because we hold all the levers. We should not get down to the level to where it's a tit for tat and it looks like it's equal, because it's not.
Right. So, also, what kind of impact do you think tweets like this have on the morale of everyday soldiers that are current? Maybe they're not currently mobilized right now, but it's like, oh, great, our commander in chief is, tweeting stuff like this.
Yeah, I think because this has been going on, I mean, all the way going back into the campaign and never stopped. I don't think that, I mean, this is also kind of a negative fallout. I don't think anybody really gives it a lot of serious credibility, and
That's true.
it certainly doesn't worry anybody at this point, I think.
Okay, yeah, because it's like, thank goodness policy has not been set because of what he says and does on Twitter
Well,
necessarily.
and that's interesting you bring that point up because that's actually something I've been writing on here recently. Is that you see a lot of the rhetoric and the words that the president uses, whether it was at the NATO summit in Brussels or at the press conference with Putin in Helsinki, and you see a lot of things he said, and many of which were just head scratchers, on the one side to just like, wait, he didn't just say that on the other. But when you look at the policies underneath what's going on there, you have to say, well, hey, that's actually pretty good policy for the
Right.
United States. For example, in the NATO, it was very inappropriate for him to dress down Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, in public in front of the cameras there.
Hmm.
But it's perfectly rational to say, hey, look, Germany, you're the economic powerhouse of this continent, and yet you're not even spending barely 1.2% of your GDP, despite years of promising that you're going to go to at least 2%, which itself is a really small number.
On,
And
on,
it's appropriate for us to say, hey, that's not fair to the United States taxpayer or our soldiers that we're providing your security when you're not willing to do so.
right.
But unfortunately, that gets lost with some of the improper things that he said to him, and that's unfortunate.
Okay. Back to Iran here. What are some of the problems with the idea of U.S. backed regime change in Iran, which is kind of what
Oh,
President Trump was
yeah.
threatening?
It was, and that was almost directly what Pompeo was talking about on Sunday,
Hmm.
which just makes me cringe because, I mean, if we thought that things in Iraq were bad, and they were when we changed regimes there, I mean, it would be substantially worse if we even thought about doing that in Iran, because the population in Iran is 4 times larger than it was in Iraq. The country
Hmm.
is, of course, substantially larger, and then you can't go in there and just like launch a few missiles like we did in Syria and think that they're going to be passive, because unlike Syria, who was fighting for their lives within their own country, Iran already has feelers out and forces outside their country, and so they could actually respond in ways
Hmm.
that would not be in our interest, and there's no reason to provoke something like that, because it's much better for them to remain, in the region and focused on their own survival and their own issues. Because politically they have a lot of issues in their country that
Right.
our external rhetoric doesn't help, because it actually gives them justification to say, look, America's trying to do this to undermine, and you got to stick with us. When otherwise, the population is really unhappy with Rouhani and certainly with
Hmm.
Khomeini as well, because
Hmm.
of their economic policies. And that's where we want the focus to be, because then they have to actually deal with substance instead of the threat of the United States doing something.
Right. Well, it just made me also think about, under the Obama administration, when we saw the revolutions take place in Egypt and other places, the Obama administration backed some of those. But yet, when students rose up in Iran and they had the Green Revolution, a while back, silence. And I'm thinking that was the type of, not I don't know if obviously we couldn't formally support, but it would have been nice to have seen some encouragement of those concerns. But yet, that's the kind of if there was a regime change that took place as a result of internal uprising, that's something that would be encouraged, right? Or that we should be think that could be positive.
Right. If there's to be regime change, it has to be completely indigenous, and the people themselves, for their own intents and their own purposes, rising up and demanding either substantial change in the way they're governed, or if they want to come up with a new form of government. That's something that they have to deal with, because the people who have to live with the outcome is the
Hmm.
one who has to decide how it's going to happen, because that's what actually has a chance to be successful and sustained. But when we try to manage it from the outside or force it from the outside, I think that's when we start to get into real trouble.
Right. I was just thinking, unlike what we saw in Libya and in Egypt, I'm thinking if something happened internally in Iran and there was a regime change, just based on their history, I think it'd probably be more of a moderating influence than what we've seen, what we saw in Egypt and Libya that ended up becoming more
You
radicalized.
could not be more properly right. You could not be more on spot on that. As a matter of fact, that this Iranian friend I was telling you about, I've actually spoken with a number of his colleagues here also, and they've long been advocating for regime change from within, but not a violent regime change, but a change that is of the people, and they believe that that's something that's actually possible. And so there's many people and several, even among some of the wealthy in Iran that definitely want to change the regime. Some of them don't want to like completely eliminate everything that's there, but they want major changes in how it's done. And we should certainly support that, because anything that's going to moderate Iran's external behavior is something we should applaud, or certainly at least tacitly support. I
Hmm.
mean, even if, for example, they had a different kind of Islamic rule that was more democratic, maybe we don't want to come out and just endorse that, but we should certainly tacitly support it, because that works towards our advantage, because it minimizes the risk that us and our allies in the region face.
Right. So, I'm also obviously Iran can't, as you mentioned before, can't really challenge us as far as militarily speaking. They don't pose a real threat to us. But within the region, I'm sure there has been some concern, especially with their potential developing nuclear weapon. Do you think it was right for President Trump to pull the United States out of the Iran deal? And if so, what's the path forward?
Yeah, no, I actually, I've supported the president on a number of things he's doing policy-wise, both in NATO, North Korea, and several other places.
Hmm.
But I got to say that I did not support pulling out of the JCPOA, and think that we're going to end up paying consequences of that. In fact, some of them we're already starting to see, and we just hope they don't get too bad. Because here's the point: we had, whether you want to say it was a flawed deal or not, and who wouldn't argue that it was flawed, but it was a deal. And according to both the United Nations and the State Department, they were abiding by the terms of the agreement. You can argue whether it was the spirit, but they certainly were abiding by the terms. There was definitely, and actually still to this day remains, inspectors from the United Nations in there and doing inspections to make sure that they don't go to nuclear weapons. Now, if that falls apart completely, in other words, if the European nations who were part of the deal, Russia and China, if they're not able to keep that thing going, well, now then we've lost all of our opportunity to influence what happens from within Iran. Now, if you say the deal's not good, then you have to have a better one. But right now, there's not even a path to a better one, because what incentive internally does Iran have to negotiate a new deal when they saw that we didn't even abide by the previous one? And in terms of moderating them, now Rouhani was definitely seen as a moderate force, but now then he's taken so much heat for the loss of for the fact that we pulled out. Now then he's having to go way to the right and to sound more radical himself, or else he's going to lose his own position within the government, which actually may happen anyway. But that would give the hand even more so to the radicals. And again, that works against our own interest, because we want to moderate them. We don't want to push them further into the radical direction. And
Hmm.
the loss of the JCPOA it gave away what influence we had, and there's nothing good to replace it.
Okay. So I want to pivot here and just talk about North Korea. You mentioned you supported President Trump's policy toward North Korea. Talking with them. What were your thoughts about his recent summit with Kim Jong Un?
Yeah, there's been lots of criticism of the president from a number of different quarters after that, because they say, oh, it was just a made for TV, image. It didn't result in anything. There's no concrete results so far, and as though there should have been concrete results after a single meeting, and that was never realistic. I mean, when you
Hmm.
look at anything that was done, I mean, Reagan, when he went to Reykjavik with Gorbachev, and some of the agreements that followed from there, I mean, they were like a year, 2 years in the process, some even longer than that. The initial agreed framework with the Clinton administration, as flawed as that was, it still took well over a year to negotiate. we're only like 2 months into this, maybe even less than that formally. And the thought that we're going to get any kind of an agreement in that short period of time is just unrealistic and doesn't understand how international diplomacy works. So this is going to take some time. But the president was right a couple of days ago when he said, look, when was the last time they fired a missile? 9 months ago. And a nuclear test was even longer ago than that. And so now you see that apparently reports that they're actually are dismantling their engine test site, which is where they developed a lot of their long-range weapons. And so they're actually taking some concrete steps. They have not done some of the things that they promised they wouldn't do. And as long as that's the case, then things are on a good path. But I will say that, the expectation should be that this is going to continue to go in ebbs and flows, and there's going to be positive developments, there'll be negative developments, but we always have to be moving towards the ultimate objective of reducing the threat to the United States, and right now we're on a path to do that.
Great. So, um, yeah, that's good to see. I personally was a little when they announced an agreement. I kind of, when I read through it, I kind of rolled my eyes. I mean, you're right that we shouldn't have maybe expected a solid agreement, but then I kind of wish the Trump administration didn't actually kind of put this out there as this grand accomplishment.
Well, and that is right. That is also that's a fair criticism as well. If I'm taking some of the his critics to task on that, then he himself also is not helping his case by making it sound like there was something concrete done and it was a major thing when it was actually the beginning. Early on, he actually said correctly that this is the beginning of a process, and Secretary Pompeo said this is the beginning, and that part is correct. But I think he wanted more credit than he has earned thus far, and that didn't help either. You're right.
Great. Well, I'm kind of at the end of my questions. Is there anything else you want to add that I haven't asked? I guess about
Yeah,
Iran or North
I
Korea.
think back to Iran. I think it's really, really important for people to understand that that they represent no military threat to American security interests because of the disparity in powers I mentioned before.
Hmm.
And there's too many people that want to say, yes, but they are doing these nefarious things throughout the region. They support terrorism here and there, as though that's a reason for us to potentially go to war. And that's not a reason to go to war, because the consequences to that to us could be so great.
Right.
There's other ways to minimize that stuff, but American military power should only be used if American interests are directly attacked or directly threatened. And short of that, we have to use other means, because the fact is you can't stop everything that's happening everywhere. And if you try, all you're going to do is make matters worse for yourself. You're going to spend more money than you need to,
Hmm.
and that's going to drain our treasuries, and it's going to dissipate our military power. And I think there's an underappreciation for how much we dissipate our ability to respond to actual potential existential fights that we may, God forbid, have to fight one day with, a conventional fight with North Korea or China or Russia anywhere. I mean, those are the things that we need to be putting our stock in so that we have military readiness to face, potential serious threats, as opposed to dissipating on these ones that are actually either minor or not even necessary.
Great. Well, I was just thinking too, as far as we may not necessarily have to engage militarily, but Israel seems to be ready to address that particular challenge if needed. As far as if
That's exactly right. In fact, that's a really good point, because of all the help that we've given them over the decades. I mean, they are the military power in that region, and the idea that Iran is going to threaten their existence is just not sustainable or not supportable by the evidence, because they are so overwhelmingly stronger. And just as important in terms of the regional dynamics is the growing friendship between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and
right.
even Israel and Russia continues to kind of contain Iran. Despite that, I mean, that's even with their weakening internal situation, that makes it less likely for them to do anything abroad, because they have to worry about their internal dynamics. All that together, it just reinforces the reason why any kind of thought of using military force from the United States right now is just a bad idea, and it's not even necessary.
Right. Well, hey, as always, it's a pleasure to have you on, Colonel Davis. We appreciate your insight.
You bet. It's been my pleasure.
All right. Hey, take care. Thank you so much.